Je déclare cette réunion ouverte.
I declare the meeting opened. Welcome to meeting number 110 of the Agriculture and Agri-Food Committee. I will begin with some reminders. Today's meeting is going to be webcast on the House of Commons website. The camera will always show the person speaking instead of the committee as a whole. And, of course, you may not take photographs or screenshots. Welcome, everyone. This is the first meeting of this new study on reciprocity of standards for carbon, standing in the name of Mr. Drouin. Very quickly, because we do have witnesses before us, I would like to make a few comments so they are on the record. The analysts are doing fantastic work. We can see that in the notes we have received. But I thought that perhaps too much had been cut, and we lost the meaning of what I was trying to say about products coming in from abroad. I did say it to the analysts, and they took it very well, so I hope we can all agree on that. Yes, that is an opportunity, and perhaps after this afternoon's meeting, we could discuss the way in which the wording of the motion is made public.
Witnesses today. So we have 4 witnesses from 4 different government departments. And I'm going to start with someone that you all know from the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Tom Rosser, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister. Welcome back, Mr. Rosser, to the committee. From the Department of Finance, Michel Gauvier, who is the Director General of International Trade Policy Division. From the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, we have Kathleen Donahue, Vice President, International Affairs. And we also have Evelyn Sue, who is Executive Director of Food Safety and Consumer Protection Directorate. And last but not least, from the Department of Environment, we have Judy Meltzer, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Environmental Protection branch. And I understand you'll have no opening remarks, but you'll be available for questions accordingly. So I'm actually going to start with Mr. Rosser. You have up to 5 minutes for opening remarks. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has a mandate to ensure the long-term economic competitiveness, sustainability, and resilience of Canadian agriculture, and agri-food sectors. Canada is among the world's top exporters of agriculture and agri-food products. Because of this strength and a predictable rules-based trading system, the Canadian agriculture and agri-food sector plays a vital strategic role as a global contributor to food security. Trade facilitates the transfer of goods, services, and technologies that enable the agricultural productivity and growth that are vital to achieving greater sustainability and food security worldwide. The role of trade in achieving not only food security and sustainability goals is growing in importance, and countries are increasingly engaging internationally to discuss these issues. As a strong proponent of the multilateral rules-based system, Canada is an active participant in international discussions on trade and sustainability. For example, at the World Trade Organization, Canada is a co-convener and an active participant in something known as the TESSD, or Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, which is a forum where members and external stakeholders can come together to discuss policy approaches and ideas to enable environmentally sustainable trade in a transparent, inclusive manner. Similarly, as a member of the OECD, Canada is supportive of their research and relationship, the research on the relationship between trade and sustainability in the agricultural sector. International discussions on trade and sustainability reflect the broad diversity of tools that countries are considering in their approaches to sustainability. This includes research and innovation, regulatory measures, subsidies, and other forms of support, as well as technical capacity building. Given its critical role in achieving global food security, Canada's view is that measures should be designed in the least restrictive manner as possible to achieve their objectives. Canadian farmers are rightfully proud of their legacy of environmental stewardship. It has been built on a commitment to continuous improvement. Through our sustainable agricultural strategy, our government hopes to be a partner in working towards achieving Canada's broader 2030 and 2050 environment and climate goals. This strategy will help set a shared direction for collective action to improve environmental performance in the sector over the long term in order to advance sustainability, competitiveness, and resilience of the sector. L'agriculture représente environ 10%.
Agriculture represents around 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Over the last, it's about 30% of global emissions. Over the last 30 years, Canada's agricultural production nearly doubled, yet the sector's greenhouse gas emissions have remained relatively stable. So that means there's been a significant decline in emissions per tonne produced. A key element in any policy approach is having sound data so that sustainability outcomes can be measured and compared. Regarding the policy approach to carbon border adjustment measures, we know that some countries are exploring the possibilities in some sectors, like steel, aluminium, and fertilizer. We're not aware of any country that is in the process of designing a carbon border adjustment that would apply to agricultural commodities and products. Canada has a long history of engaging with trading partners to advocate for market access for Canadian products and minimize any non-tariff measures put in place by trade partners. The committee's work in this area will be an important contribution. Stakeholders in Canada are extremely interested in the interface between environmental issues and international trade, and frequently take part in discussions not only in Canada but internationally. Thank you again, Chair, and thank you to the committee for your interest in this topic. Thank you, Mr. Rosser. And now Ms. Gauvier for 5 minutes.
I am the Director General of the International Trade Policy Division at Finance Canada. My team leads on federal import policy, including tariff and trade remedy policy, as well as the government's ongoing consideration of border carbon adjustments, or BCAs. I understand the committee had an interest in the BCA consultations we undertook in 2021-22, and I'm glad to be here today to talk about our ongoing work in this area. So BCAs are intended to account for differing carbon costs that companies face across jurisdictions when goods they produce are traded internationally. They typically involve border charges that seek to replicate domestic carbon pricing for imported goods, though rebates of carbon costs for exported goods could also be contemplated. The main objective of BCAs is to reduce the risk of carbon leakage, that is, movement of investment or production to jurisdictions with a lower carbon cost, thus supporting greater climate ambition and maintaining a level playing field for industries subject to carbon pricing. Given their administrative complexity and relatively high compliance burden, BCAs are typically contemplated for the most emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors, such as steel, aluminum, cement, and fertilizer, among others. The EU will be the first jurisdiction to impose a BCA with their Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, currently in a transitional reporting-only period. Border charges are currently scheduled to enter into force in 2026 for a narrow set of sectors: cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, aluminum, and hydrogen. And the UK is also on track to impose a CBAM in 2027. In terms of our own work on BCAs, in 2020, the Government of Canada announced it would explore BCAs to address carbon leakage risks and competitiveness pressures associated with domestic carbon pricing. In August 2021, the government launched consultations seeking views from a full range of industry associations representing companies in emission-intensive and trade-exposed sectors, as well as labor unions, academics, non-government organizations, think tanks, and the provinces and territories. To support these consultations, the government released the paper called Exploring Border Carbon Adjustments for Canada, which explored the policy considerations related to BCAs from an economic, environmental, and international trade relations perspective. The key messages we heard from Canadian stakeholders through our consultations were interest in a BCA from certain sectors where decarbonization presents greater challenges and the risks of carbon leakage with a rising carbon price are more prominent, but also a strong preference to retain existing carbon leakage mitigation measures, for example, free allowances provided through the output-based pricing systems alongside a potential BCA. Concerns were generally about the possibility of retaliatory measures, administrative costs and price impacts, and the importance of coordination with the United States as our largest trading partner. Several agricultural stakeholders participated in the consultations, expressing the following key comments. There was mixed and cautious support for the application of BCAs to agricultural goods, including due to concerns that it could lead to greater trade protectionism in the sector. There was recognition that carbon sources and costs in the agriculture sector are more complex and would not lend themselves well to carbon accounting associated with the BCA. There was a recommendation that the best way to ensure the competitiveness of Canadian farming is through the upfront relief of carbon pricing. And there was concern about the impact of BCAs on the cost of farm inputs, such as pesticides and fertilizers. So in exploring BCAs, we have identified considerations that are inherent to any jurisdiction that are contemplating that measure, which include the benefits of a BCA in ensuring a fair and predictable environment for businesses as they pursue industrial decarbonization, how to design BCAs that would comply with international trade obligations, and evaluating the cost impacts and compliance burden of BCAs, including cost pass-through for downstream industries. But I would note there are other considerations that are of particular relevance for Canada, one being the different provincial and territorial carbon pricing systems across Canada, which makes it difficult to design a BCA that accurately adjusts for carbon costs across the country, and also the significance of the U.S. as a trade partner and their lack of federal carbon pricing. So the government continues to contemplate this policy tool in light of these different considerations and taking into account the domestic context, including Canada's broader agenda for transition to net zero, as well as international developments. Since our consultations, we have not had further representations from the agriculture sector expressing an interest in BCAs. I'd be pleased to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gobier. Just for my benefit, BCA, I missed the acronym. Was it Border Carbon Adjustment?
Border carbon adjustments,
Okay,
yes.
thank you. We'll now turn it over to CFIA and Ms. Donahue. I think you have up to 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président, et bon après-midi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to committee members today on this important topic. My name is Kathleen Donahue. I'm the Vice President of the International Affairs Branch at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And today my remarks will relate to the treatment of imported versus domestically produced food.
Agency is a science-based regulatory agency whose mandate is the safeguarding of plant, animal, and food, which enhances the health and well-being of Canadian peoples, environment, and our economy. All food sold in Canada, whether domestically prepared or imported, must meet the food safety, nutritional quality standards, and labeling requirements of the Safe Food for Canadians regulations and the Food and Drugs regulations. With regards to the CFIA role, the agency conducts risk-based activities to ensure the safety and compliance of food, both domestic and imported. During inspection, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency verifies that food complies with Canada's food safety requirements. Regardless of the origin of the food product, the CFIA takes action when a product does not meet Canadian regulations and, in the case of an imported product, works with foreign governments to address any food safety risk as required. CFIA verifies that Safe Food for Canadian license holders meet federal food requirements. This includes sampling and testing of products, commodity inspections, and the verification of preventative control plans. The CFIA can issue border lookouts, and undertake point of entry inspections to prevent non-compliant food from entering Canada including through orders to remove from Canada or the destruction of product or the suspension, cancellation of a license. Other non-compliance actions may include corrective action requests, seizures and detention, as well as even prosecution. The CFIA may enter into arrangements with international trading partners that outline specific conditions for imports, including conditions that require the foreign government to issue certificates for specific commodities. La CIA effectue
The CFIA conducts offshore audits of foreign food inspection systems and verification of foreign establishments based on risk to ensure that products exported by these countries and facilities meet Canada's import requirements. High-risk food products such as meat and shellfish, require mandatory pre-approval of the foreign inspection system by CFIA as a condition for exports to Canada. These assessments are conducted to ensure that products exported to Canada comply with Canadian laws and regulations. In summary, the CFIA requires that imported food products meet the same level of protection as that of food products in Canada. CFIA has several mechanisms in place to ensure that imported products meet Canadian requirements. CFIA is able to take action when these products do not meet Canada's food safety requirements. Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to answer any questions.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Donoghue. And now we move to questions, beginning with Mr. Barlow. 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the department for being here. Although I guess it is interesting that this is a policy that's been, or a study that's been put forward by the government, but the officials weren't ready to talk about this last week. I guess I'm a bit concerned that this is potentially a policy that the government wants to look at implementing, but wasn't ready to even discuss it at committee. But Mr. Rosser, to your comments first, I guess. You talked about global emissions from agriculture, 30% globally. Canada's 1.6% of global emissions, and agriculture is about 8% of that, or 8 to 10%, you said, I think, is your number, of our own emissions. So we're certainly much lower than the global average when it comes to agriculture. So when it comes to our competitiveness, when we're trying, certainly in the agriculture sector, so much of what we do, we rely on international trade and trade access to other jurisdictions. In your opinion, what would implementing a carbon border adjustment on agricultural products do for Canada's competitiveness when we're already far exceeding other global jurisdictions when it comes to emissions and our environmental accomplishments?
Mr. Chair, thanks for the question. The member's quite right that, roughly speaking, agricultural emissions are about 10% of the total in Canada. There isn't really a definitive source that allows you to do comparative across the world comparisons, commodity by commodity, of emissions intensity, but the available evidence suggests that Canada is a very strong performer when it comes to greenhouse gas and sustainability characteristics in the ag sector. As I'd referenced in my opening statement, agricultural stakeholders, particularly those that are most exposed to trade, are very interested in discussions around international measures on trade. I think because their concern, as is ours, their overriding concern is that whatever measures get put in place, they do not create possibilities by trading partners for new non-tariff barriers or barriers to trade. I think is that would be my characterization anyway of the view of the agricultural sector.
And I have to find it interesting that both yourself and Ms. Govier from Finance say when stakeholders that you've consulted with are raising very real concerns, you call that interests. I would say that they are not interested. They are very worried about the potential impacts of this when no other country, in your own words, is looking at implementing this on agricultural products. So I'm really wondering why this is something we would want to go down if no other country is following that tact. But maybe to Ms. Govier, we now know that the cost of administering the carbon tax alone is about $82 million annually. It takes almost 500 bureaucrats to take on that task. I would say there's not the greatest return on your investment there. Has Finance done any similar analysis on what the cost of administering a carbon border adjustment would be for Finance Canada or CBSA or any of the other departments that would be tasked with administering this program?
We haven't done a detailed study to see what those would be, but our understanding and our belief is that it would be fairly heavy. It's not like applying a regular tariff where you simply say it's going to be 10% or whatever the number is and you apply it. There has to be an assessment of the embedded emissions in imported goods, as well as preparatory work on what the emissions are in your own country to have that comparability. I will say that the EU, from their process, we are aware that, it was sort of a 3 years long process involving kind of staffing up a group. And in the US as well, their International Trade Commission is just doing a study to kind of do some of this preliminary work on what emissions are embedded in goods. And that is a fairly heavy process too. So I won't say it wouldn't be a somewhat heavy process, but it would depend as well how you design the system.
I would hope then, if you continue to go down this road, or if the government asks you to follow this, that analysis would happen on the cost of the program and the benefits, if any, to this program to our Canadian agriculture sector specifically, as that's certainly our domain. And maybe to Mr. Rosser or whoever would be the person to answer this, you talked about the EU implementing this in 2026 on very specific industries, not agriculture. Have you consulted with the United States, who is our number one trade partner and often our number one competitor when it comes to agricultural products? And if you have done that consultation or discussions, what is their response to Canada maybe preemptively implementing a carbon border adjustment on agriculture?
Mr. Chair, I'll probably invite my colleague Kathleen. Certainly, she and I both have regular discussions with our U.S. counterparts on a variety of issues related to trade and the environment. I'm not aware of us having specifically discussed carbon border adjustments in the ag sector with them, simply because neither they nor we are in an advanced stage of considering such a measure. But Kathleen has probably had at least as many discussions with the U.S. as I have.
So I am here as the Vice President of International Affairs Branch to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, but I do wear two hats. I report to both the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, and the President of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So from an Agriculture Canada perspective, I would concur with Tom. We have not had any discussions with the U.S. on any, type of CBAM program at this juncture. Thank you.
Okay, and just to be clarified, because the way Mr. Barlow framed his question, it was the idea that the government was contemplating this. This committee is studying what's happening around the world. So I didn't hear, and just as the chair to clarify for the members, I didn't hear from any of the testimony that the government was contemplating one in Canada. We were talking about other jurisdictions, correct? Is that just maybe Ms. Govier, if you could?
So we are contemplating, it happened since 2020, a BCA, but not extending at this stage to the agriculture sector. We were really just focusing on those high emission trade exposed sectors that I mentioned earlier in my remarks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Drouin, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses who are before us. I know that when we talk about the U.S., Senator Cassidy, a Republican, and Senator Whitehouse, who's a Democrat, both have introduced a bill which would essentially impose a tariff on jurisdictions that don't have a price on pollution, or that would measure carbon intensity on pollution. So the idea that the U.S. is not necessarily talking about it, definitely the folks who have the power to introduce a law are certainly talking about it. And my goal here is not to predetermine what may happen tomorrow morning, but what may happen in 5, 10, 15 years. You've all testified that the EU and the UK by 2026, 2027 will impose a carbon adjustment tariff on fertilizer, which is an input that we all use, that farmers use in terms of growing food, but also in the steel industry, the aluminum industry, the cement industry. So obviously, the world is looking at this. Their carbon leakage is a major issue. Quand on parle en français, on parle des clauses de réciprocité, on parle des...
In French, we call them reciprocity clauses. The Europeans call them mirror clauses. The EU calls them mirror clauses. Mirror clauses are exactly what they sound like, agricultural standards that apply in Europe, and they want them to be mirrored in countries that export food to them, agricultural products to them. So the Department of Finance has had consultations on carbon adjustment mechanisms. We don't yet know how we can measure these factors very effectively. Is it the same in agriculture? Is it something we'd like to put in place but have not yet found an effective way to do it? I could start, and then my colleague Michel might have something to add. But in agriculture, yes, discussions are taking place internationally at the WTO, OECD, at UN meetings on the interface between environment and international trade. Carbon border adjustments are an aspect of that, but I do think the conversation is broader. The federal government is almost ready to put forward policies relating to agricultural products, but there's a broader international conversation to be had. We're seeing representatives from Canadian agricultural associations who attend WTO meetings or COPS meetings, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. We often hear that in Canada, since we account for less than 2% of global emissions, why do we need to do so much? But I've looked at the figures, and I know full well that, yes, Canada is emitting less than 2% of GHG emissions. But if you add up all the under 2% emitting countries, it adds up to over 40% of global emissions. So does the approach by countries emitting less than 2%, should it be to wash our hands of the whole thing and just sit back and see what others are doing and wait for higher emitters like China to do something? Is that the approach at COP meetings or other international meetings? Mr. Chairman, I can only talk about meetings that I've attended myself. When we go around the table, the issue mentioned is always the impact of climate change. That's a priority for almost every country. And no distinction is made because, for example, some small Caribbean islands emit so much fewer GHGs than large producers. We don't talk about distinctions between large emitters and small emitters. We talk about the impacts of climate change on agri-food production, on the cost of putting in place carbon tariffs at the border. We know that there are European producers in Canada as we speak. They're looking at the supply chains, be it in cement plants or steel or aluminium. They're here right now making assessments. So will this be a cost for the Canadian government, or will it represent a cost for the states putting the tariffs in place? We have no interaction. We import at finance, so other people at the government would be responsible for the export sides. Now, as for the cost, it depends on how you set up your system. The cost can be assumed by the government or passed on to exporters. There are many ways of doing it.
Talk about too, and they're not tariffs. They're about daddy duty. So I'm going to remove myself, but my good colleague Ken McDonald will take over for me. So thank you.
Thank God we brought in some Atlantic expertise. Good to have the member from Avalon. Welcome, Mr. McDonald. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes. Allez-y.
Mr. Parent, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. We're happy to have you here. What I said at the beginning of the meeting is important. We've agreed to look at climate requirements, but we would like to take a broader view. Ms. Donoghue, you did talk about this. You talked about the same standards, same crop protection levels, but that's not what local producers say. They're saying that what comes into the country is not in compliance with Canadian standards. Foreign producers often use products that are prohibited in Canada. So could you please explain any nuances there might be there? Because they are important. Thank you for the question, Mr. Perron. If I may.
Agency, we expect that all imported and domestically produced food meets the same regulatory requirements, quality requirements. So I understand and acknowledge what you are hearing, and I think if there's a specific issue, we're certainly open to exploring that and understanding what that complaint is. But with respect to what we require, we expect that people importing or producing food under the oversight of the agency, first they have to have a valid license issued by the agency. They also have to be aware of the hazards associated with the food that they are either importing or producing. And they have to have controls in place to address them, what we call a preventative control plan. And lastly, we expect them to also keep records to ensure traceability. In the case of there being an issue, we have the ability to trace.
OK, mais sur les produits.
But regarding products, the crop protection products that are being used outside the country, they're not always those used here. The same requirements apply to those products as well.
Imported food or food produced here in Canada have to meet the same regulatory requirements.
Bon, loin de moi l'idée de vous coincer, mais
I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but take duck. There's a problem that you no doubt know. Imports from countries like France have guarantees that the strains and the species aren't vaccinated, but that compromises next year's production. What about duck from Hungary or Poland? When you look at the packaging and when you open it, you can immediately see that it doesn't meet Canadian standards because it still has feathers, because there are all kinds of other things. As you said in your statements, do you want to focus on local food, domestically grown food? I'm not asking you to neglect that. That's what the CFIA should do. But our local producers are under the strong impression, and they've been saying it for 5 years, so they didn't just come to that conclusion overnight. They believe that there's a lot of pressure on locally produced food, and things coming into Canada aren't equivalent. Chinese carrots, for example, what are the crop protection products being used? You need cooperation with local authorities, and with China, that's not exactly easy at the moment, is it? I'd like to hear you on that.
D'accord. Merci encore pour vos questions, Monsieur Perron.
Thank you, Mr. Perron, for that question. With regard to duck,
Temporary suspension of imports of both poultry products from France. And that's due to highly pathogenic avian influenza vaccination program that France has. So we currently don't we do not permit the importation of poultry products from countries that vaccinate for this disease called HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza. And that's, we impose these restrictions on imports because we have to do our due diligence. And we are working at the moment.
Excuse, Madame Donahue, il reste juste comme 40.
I apologize, Ms. Donoghue. I have only about 40 seconds left. Products coming in, the products that our producers are saying don't correspond to Canadian standards. How can you explain that? We have inspectors that are working practically full-time in some agri-food production plants. What's the frequency of inspection for foreign products? How much rigor goes into that?
Est-ce qu'il y a de la approach to our inspection? And you mentioned earlier, though, the issue with Hungarian duck imports. And I'm aware that we did receive last year a complaint through our Complaints and Appeals Office at the agency. We looked into the matter. And we carried out product inspection and preventative control inspection on importers of duck meat from Hungary. We did find an importer lacking in certain areas, and we have asked that importer to implement what we call corrective action.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Donoghue. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Ms. Donoghue. Mr. Perron, Mr. Canning, 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here today. I'd like to try to get some understanding personally about, first of all, about the EU proposal or the CBAM that the EU is proposing to bring in 2026. Where does Canada stand, and I assume maybe Ms. Gauvier might be best for this, where does Canada stand in terms of carbon pricing versus the EU? Like, are we on a par with them, or are we going to take a hit because of this in terms of our exports to the EU? I just want to see how things shape up.
Yeah, and I might defer to Judy on some of this. Just to say, because I'm focused more on our BCA, so the import measure. I do know some aspects of CBAM, but not the expert. Colleagues at Global Affairs are tracking that more closely from that angle. Obviously, we feel we have quite robust carbon pricing and have been very actively engaging with the EU to ensure that that's recognized in their system. They are still in a reporting phase right now, so it's probably premature to say exactly what's going to happen. Right now, people are just exporters are providing information so that there's an awareness about what the emissions profiles are. But I think how that's actually going to hit, we'll wait until there are measures in place. But I think conversations are very active on that, and I think it would be a better place for Global Affairs to give more details on kind of the status of those. And Judy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Thanks, Michelle. No, I mean, that's exactly right. We've been working very hard with colleagues at Global Affairs as well, just to make sure that our European Union colleagues have a very good understanding of how the systems work in Canada, including across provincial and territorial and federal systems. But it's a little bit premature they're still in the reporting phase, so don't have a specific answer.
But it strikes me, it's my understanding anyways, that certainly I'm not sure if this is true throughout Europe or if it's some of the countries, they are at a level that's considerably higher than we are in terms of carbon pricing per ton of carbon. Is that not the case?
So again, not wanting to get too far ahead, given the status of where the CBAM is at in terms of implementation, I think the one thing I would note is that we need to take into account that there are different ways in which these emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries are priced under Canadian output-based pricing systems, including or other industrial trading systems like Quebec. And so it really, we need to look carefully to make sure they have a good understanding of all the provincial systems. So these are systems that are under carbon markets. So these are not, these are under trading systems. But there is, we'll continue to work closely to make sure we understand they understand well our systems and understand the price per ton as they move forward.
And another question, we live in a world where there's a lot of trade agreements. We have a trade agreement with the European Union. We have trade agreements with, CUSMA, with the United States and Mexico. How does carbon border adjustments fit into that framework? Is it all trade legal, as they say, or how would this be implemented in that world?
Yeah. I think the World Trade Organization rules are probably the broadest framework that we're operating under. Obviously, introducing new border measures is something that is of interest to WTO members. I think the key thing is ensuring that the measure is being undertaken strictly for an environmental purpose. So it's not, strictly about protecting our industries or what have you. It's really about ensuring that our carbon goals are met, both for our country, but also avoiding carbon leakage. That is, those carbon emissions just going to other countries, which is not a good environmental outcome. And also making sure that the adjustment actually matches what the domestic producers are facing. So there's kind of basic trade agreements have non-discrimination clauses. That means, and national treatment clauses, which means you're treating the foreign exporter on a level playing field with how you're treating your own domestic companies. So ours face a carbon price. The carbon price you should be seeking to impose on others should reflect that level playing field. The devil will very much be in the details, and there are probably going to be disputes arising around this because of that, and whether countries have actually hit the right mark in terms of that balance.
You have 1 minute left if you like, Mr. Canning.
The one sort of sector that seems to be in this EU list would be fertilizer. That would affect our agriculture sector. Just wondering if you could give us somebody on the panel, give us a little précis of how exposed we are. I know we make some fertilizer here. We probably import some from the United States. We might import some. I'm just a little idea of where we would be exposed to this kind of measure.
Perhaps I can take a shot at that, Mr. Chair, just to say that we use the term fertilizer, but my understanding is the EU is specifically targeting nitrogen fertilizer, of which we do not export significant volumes to the European Union, in contrast to other types of fertilizer.
But in terms of importing,
we do import nitrogen fertilizer in the eastern part of the country. About 80% of the variable cost of producing it is natural gas. So it can come from North Africa, it can come from Trinidad, it can come from various parts of the world. I'm less certain what the trade flow is this way, but I would be surprised if we imported significant volumes from the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Canning. We'll now turn to Mr. Steinle for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Rosser, I was listening to some of the answer you gave my colleague, Mr. Barlow, and you said there isn't really comparable of how we're doing environmentally with that 10% of ag emissions to other areas of the world. Although we have a colleague coming up on the next panel from the Global Institute of Food Security that did a study in 2022 that examined the carbon footprint and production of various crops, and they were canola, non-durum wheat, field peas, durum wheat, and lentils. And they compare that carbon footprint to countries including Australia, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States. And the results demonstrated that Canadian producers, particularly in Saskatchewan and Western Canada, are producing crops with the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide equivalents among regions compared. So we do have actual data. So has the Ag Department taken that data into consideration when they're looking at implementing some of these different policies that we are already doing a very good job, and we shouldn't be trying to penalize our farmers further?
Mr. Chair, yeah, just on that, there absolutely are people who have, including the upcoming witnesses, that have done comparative analysis on greenhouse gas intensity. And what I had meant by my earlier comment was that there is no single definitive global source where people go, aha, these people have it. There are different sources, and in general, those sources that exist show that Canada's performance is very favorable. But again, there's different studies that show different gradients of that. I'm aware of this one being published, and absolutely we take account of all available analysis in that area.
So if there's different sources, would you share with this committee some of the other sources? Because this is one of the most definitive studies that I've seen when it comes to our comparables. And it's not just compared to the supply chain too, not just field. It compared from field to fork, everything in the export. So if there are other studies that you are using at Ag or Environment or Health Canada, which makes most of our ag policy, could you share those studies with us?
Mr. Chair, there are certainly the Food and Agriculture Organization publishes some comparative data in this area. The OEC doesn't do so regularly, but I think they have at times in the past. Certainly, we'd be happy to share with the committee those analyses of which we are aware in this area.
Thank you very much. To Ms. Donoghue or Ms. Sue, I've heard from industry and from farmers that your agency lacks the necessary resources to work in a timely manner or even enforce currently existing regulations properly. So do you have an idea of what the additional burden on that CBAMs would impose on the CFIA, or does the Department of Finance possibly know the cost associated with the additional support for the CFIA?
So, not with regards to CBAM. We have not looked at that in relation to our work at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is focused on food safety, animal and plant health. Just, in general, in terms of our resourcing, we take a risk-based approach to target our inspection and to verify compliance. And, in doing so, we look at, location, scope, frequency of our activities in relation to the type of product imported and the associated risk to human health and to consumer protection. And so that really kind of, allows us to focus our resources in the area of greatest need and greatest risk. Thank you. I don't know, Evelyn, if you have anything else you wanted to add.
And I guess I would just add from a border carbon adjustment perspective that to the extent that a border carbon adjustment is increasing the cost for companies that want to get into Canada, it would likely decrease the amount of imports that are coming in. So I would think the CFIA would not be affected in terms of needing more resources. I think where we would see it is more on the administration side. For example, ECCC expertise in terms of ensuring that we know what the embedded emissions are in goods, CBSA at the border, finance to some extent as well.
So on that topic of the embedded emissions, the process can create administrative burdens to the exporting country. And I'm just curious if the Department of Finance has an estimate on what those costs could be in Canada.
Is this with respect to complying with like the EU CBAM, for example? I don't have that. As I said, it's more colleagues at Global Affairs Canada that are tracking the CBAM and its implications for Canadian exporters, so it would be best directed there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll now turn to Ms. Taylor-Roy for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to clarify, because in doing this study, we're trying to assess the impact of CBAMs being applied by the EU or the United States, where there is interest in discussion right now. In fact, I think the stat is that 73% of Americans think there should be border adjustment mechanisms put in place to protect their farmers. And wouldn't these CBAMs that other countries put in place, wouldn't that actually benefit countries that have strong environmental policies and whose farmers already have a good environmental track record?
I can speak briefly to that. Generally, that should be the case, and I know we have certain industries that are exporting to the EU in sectors that will be affected by the CBAM, and they feel that they will benefit from having a green premium of being cleaner. So to the extent that that's the case, there could be those benefits, depending, again, how it's all designed.
And so any reduction in our environmental, if we move backwards on our environmental program, that could have the effect of actually putting our farmers at a competitive disadvantage if, in fact, CBAMs were put in place by many of the countries that we export to, because we're such a large exporter. Is that correct?
Right, to the extent that it's based on kind of what our pricing is in Canada or what our emissions performance is in Canada, then that could be the case if those deteriorate vis-a-vis other countries that are exporting to those markets.
And we've heard from my Conservative colleagues that, and I agree, that our agricultural sector is actually relatively good when it comes to emissions, carbon emissions. So in fact, it seems to me that we would have an advantage not only in terms of our exports may not get the tariff or as much of a tariff as imports from other countries to, for example, the EU or the US, but also we would, having the environmental program or the price on pollution in place in Canada encourages new technologies, encourages Canadians to develop these things, and there might be a bigger market for that if some of these other countries are now facing CBAMs from the EU or US or other countries. Is that correct?
I would say that part of the motivation for CBAMs is to kind of increase the level of ambition, not just in the market where they're introduced, but elsewhere, so that countries can have better access and perform better. So I can't speak directly to how that implicates the agriculture sector, but in principle, that's correct.
I would only add to that I mean, I think that we would, with any kind of, and we see many examples of this outside of CBAMs and Carter examples, where ideas that, are good, put in place by trading partners that are good in theory, can create non-tariff barriers, can cause impediments to trade. And that would be, I think if the system worked as it was intended to, that I suspect Canadian agricultural products would fare very well if and when trading partners impose CBAMs or related measures on Canadian products. The difficulty is that it's a complicated thing to do, and either deliberately or not, that trading partners could undermine trade.
It does appear that this is the way the world is going right now. We see the EU, looking at them in many sectors. We see the U.S. clearly. There's been legislation introduced looking at these. So would Canada really have a choice in that case? Like we'll be subject to other countries' CBAMs at that point, and our farmers are going to, if they have, we have a strong pollution pricing program here. So wouldn't we want, in terms of protecting our farmers, to also put in place those border adjustment mechanisms to avoid imports from countries that don't have the same environmental standards as we do?
I guess just to clarify that the more important policy that is helping us in those markets is our carbon pricing. Whether we have a border carbon adjustment or not doesn't get us a better access into the EU market. It's more about addressing the carbon leakage that could be arising in our market.
Right, but to the extent we import some goods in certain sectors, wouldn't that equalize the playing field a little bit so that countries that don't have carbon pricing mechanisms wouldn't have an advantage over our farmers?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think I only have 30 seconds, so I'll cede that back to the chair.
Thank you. Always appreciate that. 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît, Monsieur Perron.
Mr. Perron, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Donoghue, you won't be surprised my question is to you. We weren't done. You said that there is a block on duck from Hungary, but people did come in, and people are seeing it. I don't know how a local product would have made it to the market with these same issues. Isn't there a problem there?
Merci pour la question, Monsieur Perron.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Perron. As I explained earlier,
management approach. And we are a science-based organization, and we conduct that science-based assessment of hazards, really looking at there's sort of three rubrics, if you will. One is our regulatory framework. We have import control policies designed to comply with both international and national food safety standards. As I said, the imported product and that produced in Canada have to meet those standards. The other element is our inspection and monitoring. We regularly inspect food imports. We use a risk-based approach to do that, to point which, where do we focus our resources, and then we also look to collaborate with.
Je vous entends, Madame Donahue, très bien.
I do hear what you're saying, and thank you for answering my question. But if I understand correctly, there are fewer inspections on food coming in from abroad than food grown or produced domestically. On Chinese carrots, how can you explain that the U.S. doesn't let them in, saying that it's because they're protecting the quality of soil and protecting against disease? What I hear is Canada often has higher standards than the U.S., so why are Chinese carrots coming in here, but they're banned from the U.S.?
Je dois avouer que je suis pas au courant.
I'm not aware of this particular situation regarding carrots from China. But I can say
residue monitoring program at the agency, where we annually survey for compliance. So it's testing food in specific categories, and those are meat, dairy, eggs, honey, maple products, processed fruits, and vegetables. Does that make your 40 seconds? J'espère.
You did very well, Ms.
just saying.
Donahue. Thank you. And merci beaucoup, Monsieur Parent. Monsieur Cannings, 2 minutes 30 seconds, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Canning, 2.5 minutes.
Continue with, again, trying to understand how the EU CBAM is working right now. I assume we're either in or entering into this reporting phase where European importers in those sectors, I assume, just fertilizer, steel, cement, will have to report out the carbon intensity of the materials they're. So if they're importing Canadian aluminum, for instance, they're here now trying to figure out what that carbon intensity is and whether Canada has, and does Canada's carbon tax, I assume, has something to do there, right?
So, again, not wanting to speak out of turn about the system, but during the reporting phase, I think they are less looking at whether our carbon pricing is comparable to the EU pricing and whether a charge would apply. I think they are sorting through the reporting mechanisms, making sure that the information provided is well substantiated and kind of, the methodologies are all correct to make sure that they have a good stream of information coming during this phase. And then that kind of assessment of the carbon pricing becomes more relevant when the charge is actually in place.
And is this some kind of like life cycle analysis of, sometimes it gets pretty complicated calculating the carbon intensity of a product when there's several steps to it?
Yes, and they do go a little bit beyond just, I think, the product itself, and I'm looking to Judy to help me out if I'm getting it wrong. I don't believe it's a full life cycle analysis, though.
And maybe I'll just add, and again, we'll defer to Global Affairs for CBAM specifics, but they're looking at an explicit price on carbon, right? This is what CBAM's taking into account, is whether a country has an explicit price on carbon.
I think I'll just leave it there.
All right, Mr. Cannings.
Thank you.
We'll do our last round. Mr. Barlow, over to you. We'll try to do 5 minutes, but just we'll do 5 minutes. Go ahead.
I don't know if I'll take that long, Chair, but I appreciate that. But I think this is a really important point to make, and Mr. Oster and Ms. Gauvier, you kind of touched on it, that a carbon border adjustment by the EU or the United States doesn't benefit Canadian producers, that because we have a much better carbon footprint in agriculture, that somehow gets us better access. And I'll give you just a real-life example that I'm sure Mr. Rosser knows well, is Harmony Beef in Alberta redid their entire kill floor to access the EU to meet the EU standards for beef imports. The EU imports exactly zero pounds of Canadian beef, despite meat processing plant in Alberta going essentially everything they could do to meet EU standards. So I would look at a CBAM as another non-tariff trade barrier that the EU or other jurisdictions will implement to block, as Ms. Leah Taylor-Roy said, to protect their own producers. So I guess my question to either one of, or maybe Ms. Donahue, you would know better, with the EU implementing a CBAM in 2026, 2007, I understand that this is not going to include agriculture. Is there a set standard, let's say, that, or an organization that is overseeing and administering that carbon border adjustment that is very clearly defined, that if that other jurisdiction, Canada, for example, wants to import or export a product into the EU, that we know exactly what the game is and what the standards are we're asking to be met? Or in your experience, could this very well be just another non-tariff trade barrier that will make it that much more cumbersome for Canadian products to access those markets? I know, big question, but I think it's very, very important that we understand exactly what we're getting ourselves into here.
Perhaps, Mr. Chair, I'll take an initial attempt at answering, but other colleagues may have something to add. Yeah, it is absolutely the case that we are concerned that even well-meaning environmental measures, we're talking, when it comes to carbon border adjustments in the agricultural world, we're still talking in hypotheticals because nobody has proposed one. But certainly the concern would be, even if it was very well designed, that it could, as you know, as some of the non-tariff barriers the member cited in relation to the export of beef, we encounter that all the time, and there is certainly potential for carbon border adjustments, other climate measures to turn into non-tariff barriers, and it's a risk that we will work to actively manage. I think avoiding those types of things is one of the discussions that Canadian agricultural stakeholders are really passionate about discussing, not just domestically, but also internationally. And I had another point, but it's escaping me, so in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that.
My last question then is, so by getting your point, there is no standard in place right now. So this could very well be another non-tariff trade barrier blocking our access into those markets, as again, Ms. Taylor-Roy mentioned, to protect their producers. So in saying that, is a CBAM WTO compliant, and do we know the answer to that, or has the WTO done some work on ensuring that those countries that are implementing these types of policies are going to have very clear guardrails in terms of how to access those markets? Do you know that?
There are no existing WTO rules specifically addressing this type of measure, and the WTO role is different. They don't take the role of kind of policing things. It's really up to members to express concerns over that. I believe there has been some concerns raised over the CBAM at the WTO by other countries. It's yet to be seen, I think, whether that evolves into a dispute where these things will really be tested. So just it's a bit premature, I guess, to comment on whether that's going to cause issues.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. We'll turn over to Mr. Lewis for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank the witnesses as well. Appreciate you being here and your ongoing work. And I think that you can help us as we're exploring the strategic advantages with the continuing shift towards sustainability in Canada's agriculture sector. In recent years, Canada has seen a significant shift towards sustainability and carbon neutrality in its agriculture sector, and Canadians are increasingly prioritizing these aspects, recognizing the importance of sustainable practices for long-term food security and both for environmental health as well. And we're feeling that momentum in the ag sector to drive change with collaboration with technology, infrastructure, policy, finance. One of the examples that I know of locally is work being done at the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph, developing a plan to enhance climate-smart agriculture with it aims to produce 26% more food by 2050 while reducing emissions, which means that you can have more productivity, more sustainable farming, and higher profits for farmers at the same time. And I hope we can all agree that and work together for those results. I wanted to address the initial questions to Tom Rosser from from the Agriculture Ministry. and ask about what financial incentives, programs, and support mechanisms are already in place to encourage farmers and agribusinesses to adopt more sustainable practices.
Mr. Chair, I thank the member for the question. And it is absolutely, I think, the case that that strong sustainability performance, irrespective of border adjustment measures or what other countries may do, can be good economics for the ag sector. Although there are cases where farmers need assistance to implement something that will have long-term sustainability benefits. And although I won't describe them in detail, I suspect many of them will be known to the members of this committee. We as a department have announced something like $1.5 billion in programming in the agro-environmental space over the past several years to try and assist farmers to realize those opportunities and recognize that even things that can sometimes of long-term economic benefit as well as environmental benefits sometimes have an upfront cost that can present a barrier to farmers adopting them.
Question, the sustainable agriculture strategy, addressing those long-term benefits right now. Can we do that? Can we adopt sustainability, achieve that carbon neutrality, protect the environment, and also help our economy and basically feed more people with less inputs?
I would just note, Mr. Chair, that a number of commodity groups in the ag sector have set net zero targets for themselves for 2050. Are very anxious to partner. One element of the incentives to try and realize these opportunities is the development of an offset system, and perhaps Judy can speak briefly to that.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just adding to the measures that Tom referenced, the Canada's carbon offset system, which was launched in 2022, which is basically offers an opportunity for reductions that are beyond business as usual, removals, for example, in the ag sector, which is a priority sector, to earn some revenue from voluntary initiatives that reduce or remove emissions. And we're Environment and Climate Change Canada is in the process of developing some different protocols for agricultural projects. So trying to find crediting opportunities for reductions in methane from beef cattle, from manure management, from enhanced soil organic carbon. So it's just one other way in which to try and pull forward and try and kind of recognize the added value of those types of initiatives.
Thank you for that. It also can build resilience and with more extreme weather and conditions. That's something that can help, and I appreciate that. Maybe I could switch over in the final minute to Ms. Govier. That shift to sustainability in the agriculture sector, how can that enhance Canada's competitive advantage in a global market these days?
About 30 seconds, please.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that. I can speak to how it might impact if there's a market that has some kind of border measures in place. An EU-type border measure, having the pricing in place certainly helps in terms of how our exports are recognized. If it's a different system that's based on more emission intensity, not so much about the pricing, there's potentially advantages there too, but it really depends on what's in place in those markets.
And the best time to start is now, so I thank you for your time. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Chair's just going to exercise a couple questions himself, maybe to even if I draw a little bit of ire from my colleagues. But I do just want to ask a couple questions. I think Mr. Barlow's question around how, because the entire concept of what we're talking about here can cut both ways. If Canadian agriculture is properly accounted for in its environmental stewardship, it can be a trade advantage. Only if so much so that is being recognized in the international market. So my question would be to perhaps Ms. Govier or to you, Ms. Meltzer, who is taking up the lead within the Government of Canada to engage with our international partners? I take notice that agriculture is not yet being contemplated for border adjustment mechanisms in the jurisdictions we've talked about, but both either, I guess it could be a concern that Mr. Barlow has highlighted or a competitive advantage to Canada, depending on how it's implemented, and an actual net benefit really depends on how we engage and inform about the evidence that we have in this country on this. And we know that there are farmers in other jurisdictions like Europe that are saying we want those mirror clauses. And so you could see how agriculture could come down the line. Who is taking the lead? Is that a GAC lead? Is that finance, ECCC? How are we engaging? That would be my question.
I would say it is more of a GAC lead, although we are in very close touch, both ECCC and ourselves. If agriculture were implicated, obviously agriculture as well would be part of those conversations. As I said, we have been implicated a little bit more from learning from the EU and the approach that they're taking to help with our thinking internally. But there is a lot of thought also being given to ensuring that other markets are aware of our situation and how our environmental performance should maintain us access. And I would say there are discussions in international forums on these issues as well, and as well with the U.S. amongst many other issues that we discuss with the U.S.
Just two quick others. In terms of clarity for this committee, was it stated that as it relates to the European Union CBAM proposal for 2026, that it rests on the premise of a carbon price, or is there some mechanism on carbon intensity of a per unit of cement, fertilizer, what that may be, or is it just about having an actual price and that will dictate tariff or no tariff?
Look to Global Affairs colleagues to confirm that. My understanding is that there could potentially be scope for individual companies to argue that they have a very low footprint, and so regardless of pricing, they could have access. But things may have evolved since then on that front, so probably best for Global Affairs.
Maybe, Mr. Chair, we can undertake to follow up with Global Affairs colleagues and get as definitive an answer as exists from them.
Last piece would be around the American position. Some of the members of this committee had the opportunity to be in Congress last spring. I was in Congress in July and tried to ascertain what the American position is, because although it was mentioned in testimony there is not a federal carbon price in the United States, there's certainly a lot of taxpayers' dollars used through the Inflation Reduction Act that is being incentivizing. That has a true cost in the Treasury sense. Can you explain, Ms. Gauvier, any of the American position? Because I take notice what I can ascertain from your testimony. You're responsible for any type of Canadian reciprocity that may come from other jurisdictions imposing this. What is the American view? Do you have any, or maybe Mr. Rosser, on agriculture? It seemed to me that it was kind of, as opposed to a pricing approach, it would be more of a club approach. Either you're doing something to be a part of the environmental solution, or you're not, and there would be a tariff wall, or there wouldn't be. Can you speak to anything that you can give us a little bit more on the American perspective? Because that is crucially important with the nexus of our trading relationship.
Yeah, would agree that that's a critical relationship. Obviously, we want to make sure that that trade flows well between our countries. There have been different proposals, legislative, that have come out in the U.S. I won't get into the details because I don't know them off the top of my head, but I will say that because the U.S. does not have federal carbon pricing, they would be looking at something very different to what the EU is looking at, which is a very price-based thing. It would probably be based on emission intensities. There could be this concept that, cleaner countries are coming together for something, but there are different proposals out there, not totally clear yet exactly where things are going to land, including where the administration might want to go specifically on this.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for the brief indulgence. I'll, on your behalf, thank the witnesses for their testimony here today and their contribution through their various departments. So thank you so much to the witnesses. Colleagues, don't go very far. I am going to suspend just for a couple minutes. We're going to get Dr. Webb up and our other witnesses from Association Producteurs Maraîchers de Québec. So just we'll be back in 2 minutes. Meeting suspended. Souhaiter le bienvenue aux témoins.
I would now like to welcome the witnesses for our second panel. The Global Institute for Food Security, Dr. Stephen Webb.
And aussi avec
and the Association des producteurs maraîchers du Québec, the Quebec Association of Market Garden Producers, Catherine Lefebvre and Patrice Léger-Bourgoin. Thank you both for being here with us today and for the work that you do in the sector.
Excuse, est-ce que les tests ont été faits pour les témoins en ligne?
Oui, c'est ça.
Were the tests conducted for online witnesses? Yes, they have been. They always are. We do that with our team, so rest assured that's been done, Mr. Perron. There will be up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions.
Webb, over to you, coming in from Saskatchewan, I suspect, today. Over to you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. As the chair mentioned, my name is Steve Webb. I'm the CEO of the Global Institute for Food Security, or GIFS, at the University of Saskatchewan. GIFS works with partners to discover, develop, and deliver innovative solutions for the production of globally sustainable food. Serving as agriculture's innovation catalyst, GIFS is connecting the agri-food ecosystem, advancing innovation, and bridging the gap to commercialization to deliver resilient and sustainable food security for all stakeholders. Mr. Chair, there's a gap between our investment in research and delivering market-impacting innovation. We know this because both the Conference Board of Canada and the Global Innovation Index highlight the gap between our innovation input or investment and our innovation output and performance. This simply means we don't receive the commensurate value for what we invest. GIFS functions to help bridge the gap through solutions that accelerate innovation. On today's topic, Mr. Chair, a border carbon adjustment is essentially a tax or a fee placed on imported goods from another country that may not have as stringent carbon pricing system. The theory is that all goods in a country, whether domestic or imported, are subjected to the same carbon pricing system. The fee will be based on how much a carbon footprint the production of a good has. The intent behind the border carbon adjustments is to level the playing field in international trade and incentivize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions globally. However, there are a number of factors to consider with border carbon adjustments, so they do not or are not ultimately a barrier to Canadian trade and negatively impact productivity. One important consideration is how are we going to align on measurement, reporting, and verification protocols that reflect the regional differences of agriculture when measuring carbon emissions in production. It's important to note that the border carbon adjustment has been designed around built industries like electrical, aluminum and steel, cement, and other defined controlled work processes. Agriculture is different. Given the natural environment where agriculture takes place, it varies not only from year to year, but by location to location, making measurement and verification and reporting more challenging. Canada's agriculture is in a position of strength. As mentioned in the last session, a study commissioned by GIFS demonstrates that major crops that we produce, particularly in Western Canada, canola, non-durum wheat, field peas, durum wheat, and lentils, all have the lowest carbon intensity compared to other regions, especially when we include the impact of agronomic practices on soil carbon emissions. However, we need to ensure that we're harmonizing measurement and reporting and verification standards for agriculture across the world. And we're not there yet, and this challenge needs to be addressed first. Another consideration is competitiveness. Our agricultural exports could be subject to additional costs in other regions that deem our carbon regulation less stringent than theirs, increasing our export costs and reducing our competitiveness on a global stage. One other consideration is how this would impact trade agreements such as the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. These adjustments could hamper these agreements or support them based on how we and our partners align. The intent is to ensure a degree of fairness in trade, and this could be seen as an advantage for Canada. The caution would be to understand the issue of fairness for exports, not only from Canada, but also from low-income countries. How fair would it be to level the same fees on exports from low-income countries without enabling them to be as efficient and effective as Canadian producers? Finally, while the adoption of a border carbon adjustment may lead to a leveling of the playing field in carbon pricing, potentially enabling the creation of new revenue streams for Canadian producers from sequestering carbon and producing some of the lowest carbon-intensive crops in the world, we need to understand the following. A, foundational to implementation for ag requires global harmonization and support. Less than a quarter of the countries that have signed on to the Paris Accord have implemented carbon pricing, and given the potential impact on international trade, organizations like the WTO need to align on a framework where border carbon adjustments are not seen as either a non-tariff trade barrier or an unfair government subsidy. Agriculture is different, and we need time and investment to align on measurement, reporting, and verification protocols to successfully implement a policy and understand the cost to implement and how the cost and potential revenues can be shared. In closing, the one thing I think about this topic is that if you can measure it, you can improve on it, and innovation is key. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to comment on this topic, and I welcome questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Dr. Webb. Maintenant, nos amis.
And now we'll be hearing from the Association des producteurs maraîchers du Québec. Ms. Lefebvre, please go ahead. Chairman, committee members, thank you for the invitation. All issues relating to reciprocity of standards are a priority concern for us. Market globalization has gathered pace and supply chains recovered from the pandemic. More than ever, Quebec market garden producers are competing with their counterparts in the U.S., Latin America, Europe, and even Asia. Against this backdrop, the transition to a low-carbon economy raises many questions. Given the volume of international trade, differences in carbon pricing can pose a problem. We need to avoid differences that exacerbate the disadvantage in competitiveness that market garden producers already face. The issue of border carbon adjustments is complex. It should not be taken lightly. There must be a reciprocal standard so that Canadian producers do not end up carrying the cost of regulations. In other words, Canadian market garden producers must achieve parity with imported products. It's also imperative that Canada closely examine the opportunities and risks associated with establishing a Canadian border carbon adjustment mechanism in cooperation with the provinces and in the light of international developments, particularly in Europe. Production costs are already higher in Quebec than for our main competitors. That's what our analyses show. It's because of provincial and federal regulations. This results in increasingly unsustainable pressure on the profit margins of our farms and is even jeopardizing our sector's very survival. We should not exacerbate something that is already a problem. As for quality, Canada has health and traceability rules to ensure that local products are safe for human consumption. The use of crop protection products is also tightly controlled. We believe that regulations and regulatory authorities must be uncompromising. All fruit and vegetable imports must comply with the same requirements as those applying to our own producers. No compromise is acceptable, but that's not what's happening at present. We come back to Chinese carrots, which are imported into Canada at lower prices than those produced locally. The conditions under which they're produced are largely unknown. Are crop protection products used there authorized in Canada? Do they pose a danger to health or to the environment? These are questions we think you would be asking, and I wasn't convinced by the explanations we heard earlier today. In the U.S., carrots from China are not on supermarket shelves. Canada and 180 other countries and territories do not authorize China to export carrots to the U.S. to them. The criteria applied are designed to control and protect the soil against the spread of diseases that could be carried across the border by root vegetables. Canada is moving quickly and decisively to close its borders to Chinese electric cars, but it refuses to apply the same approach to Chinese vegetables as our U.S. neighbors. Is this a two-tier approach? Well, the answer is self-evident. Importing Chinese carrots into Canada while local stocks are still available puts downward pressure on carrot prices in the country as wholesalers and retailers substitute them for local products to increase their bargaining power with local producers. As for mirroring provisions, which Ms. Taylor-Roy was asking about, Production methods are virtually unregulated in international agreements. We were talking about mirror clauses, reciprocal clauses, as I was saying. Production methods are virtually unregulated in international agreements. Requirements relating to the way in which products are grown are generally not imposed on imported products, and this is becoming increasingly a problem. Here's an example from earlier 2024. Quebec's Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, with the support of several other provinces, applied to register a substitute for a commonly used product whose producer had decided to stop marketing it. In the registration application, the Quebec Ministry of Agriculture argued that the request was necessary for beet production, given the absence of effective alternatives at reasonable cost. In support of the application, it was estimated that if the application were rejected, losses would amount to $15 million a year, which is half the value of the Quebec harvest. The Pest Management Regulatory Agency refused to register a product widely used by our U.S. competitors. Under these circumstances, how can we compete on equal terms with U.S. giants just south of the border? In conclusion, the market garden sector is experiencing overwhelming pressure on its ability to compete due to a demanding regulatory environment without the constraints of an equally demanding reciprocity of standards. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, both of you.
Mr. Barlow, I'm going to start with you. Colleagues, I am going to try to get 2 rounds in. We owe it to our witnesses. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Barlow. 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and providing your insights. My questions are going to be for Mr. Webb. First off, thank you very much for the work GIFS did on some of the analysis of Canadian agriculture and our carbon footprint compared to other parts of the world. I think those results are staggering in terms of just showing how the global standard that we set in Canada compared to other jurisdictions. And I think the position for leadership and government in Canada should be encouraging the rest of the world to get to where Canada already is when it comes to fertilizer use, efficiency, precision agriculture, and all those things. We have an incredible story to tell, and your work is certainly helping us do that. In regards to your testimony, you said agriculture is different than the built industries, as you put it, that are going to be under the jurisdiction of a new CBAM in the EU and perhaps other jurisdictions. My questions that were to our department heads are going to be similar to you. My concern with a CBAM is that although maybe best of intentions, we've all heard the analogy of the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions, that this could be another example of a non-tariff trade barrier where there's going to be that protectionism in other jurisdictions. In your opinion, what are the potential detriments of this if there is not a very clear standard or regulation outline in terms of what is other jurisdictions would be asked to meet to access those markets? Now, I know that agriculture is not included in the EU plan that is coming out in 2006-2027, but if that were to be expanded to include agricultural products, how critical is it that there's a very clear set of regulations or set of criteria, and that those jurisdictions make science-based decisions that if we do meet that criteria, that we access that market?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I think, one of the other witnesses said, the devil is in the detail. I think in the case of agriculture, and even pointing to GIF's own study, we ran a carbon life cycle analysis from end to end in terms of the impact it had. We followed the accepted international rules. And one of the things that it does not measure is the impact of agronomic practices on the contribution that the soil has on carbon footprint. And when you follow the quote-unquote accepted practices, it misrepresents Canada's footprint. It actually misrepresents also the United States and Australia's footprint relative to France and Germany. And when you look at agronomic practices and consider the impact on soil carbon sequestration, you see Canada pulls further ahead from everybody else, and the Americans and the Australians actually outperform their European peers. Now, we did that to put the juxtaposition what the standard international rule is, which is based around stick-built industries or built industries versus agriculture. I think it points to the need to have an international agreement on what are we measuring and how are we counting it. Our study also pointed out, because remember, we not only looked at Canada relative to our trading peers, but we also looked at the regional breakdown of Canada, Western Canada and Saskatchewan. And again, it reflects the differences of agronomic practices at the region. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all on how we measure. We need to have a one-size-fits-all on the criteria of which we're measuring, but optimize the measurements and the models that would go into a carbon footprint analysis for a good under a border carbon adjustment process that reflect the performance in the region. So again, I think it really gets complicated, and I will be honest, it worries me a bit about the added cost on producers on the entire value chain to implement such a process unless there's additional benefits, which would be increased trade opportunities, more export opportunities for Canada. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge. The other challenge is I don't know if the international organizations that would have to implement it are prepared to deal with this, because it could be very much perceived. Remember, in the context of the Paris Accords, only about a quarter of the countries have actually implemented a carbon price. And again, if you can't get agreement at that level on a carbon price, other countries might perceive.
I've only got about 30 seconds left. I did want to get one more quick question.
Sorry.
That's okay. I appreciate your insight. I want to get one more question in. And that is my concern, is that if we meet this international standard, and I think of Canadian cattle, durum wheat, so the EU has a standard, but then every country implements their own little niche issues that block Canadian products. In your opinion, is it possible to have an international standard that everyone would adhere to? And how difficult would that process be? You measure the emissions or carbon footprint of agriculture.
Well, we're not there yet on an international agreement, and I think it's an opportunity for Canada to lead the way. Because again, one of the things that people talk about, this idea of a sustainable ag system, we've got it already in Canada. We have a very good sustainable ag system based on the principles of regenerative ag at scale. I think this is an opportunity for us to lead the way.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. Thank you, Dr. Webb. I'll turn it over to Ms. Murray for up to 6 minutes.
Well, thanks, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And I love that last comment that this is an opportunity for Canada to lead the way, just as we have done through the powering past coal and working to assist other countries in reducing their emissions from the coal industry. So we've heard a number of comments that worried about added costs and worried about the cost on farmers and benefits, if any, from a carbon adjustment to border carbon adjustment. But what I'm hearing is that it's complex. There's a number of departments that are working together to identify those complexities. There's organizations such as GIFS feeding in. So are there other things that the witnesses are recommending so that this inevitable process is as complete and fair as possible for Canadian farmers?
Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Webb, and then we'll go to a comment if you have one for the Association de Marché.
Well, I think from a Canadian perspective, as I mentioned, we already lead the way. We've implemented technologies like that was pioneered here in Western Canada and Saskatchewan, like no-till, minimum till, herbicide-tolerant canola rotation. The problem is that when you look at how we look at measurements, there's arbitrary dates. 2015, the Paris Accord. How are we, from a Canadian perspective, going to recognize the contribution that farmers have already made? For example, one of the farmers on our grower advisory panel has been practicing no-till for 40 years. On their farming operation, which is 29,000 acres in Saskatchewan, they've increased the soil carbon from 3% to 6%. I don't think that individual is going to get any recognition under the amount of carbon that they've sequestered. So again, I think that's part of the conversation that we need to have about how do we ensure that we don't discourage the ongoing sustainable practices that are in place here in Canada while other countries catch up to us.
Other comments?
The leadership.
It's a question of leadership. When we look at Europe, Europe is trying to harmonize practices as part of free trade agreements that they have. Here in North America, every Canadian provinces, or more or less, has its own system. The U.S. federal government, as we said, has not provided any general rules. It's up to the states to set up their own practices. So there is a need for harmonization given the volume of trade that moves over the border. The second aspect concerning leadership, I'll take the U.S. as an example. The U.S. government wants to give producers the means to be truly competitive, and we've seen just how much support there is in the Inflation Reduction Act. Here in Canada, farmers are still waiting to see what measures will be put in place by provincial and Canadian governments to provide support for farmers in the climate transition.
So just to go back to my broader question is, my understanding, it is not if there's going to be border carbon adjustments, including for very important segments like agriculture. It's about how to do it. Mr. Webb and others, do you see the current players that are feeding into this, the departments, which we saw a number of departments involved, do we have the players at the table to make sure that we have a harmonization, recognition of work already done, though without having that being a reason not to continue to innovate and do more work? What players are not yet at the table that should be?
I think I'll jump in, sorry for being rude. I think one of the things that I see that is happening is more from the leadership from the industry. And you see organizations like CANSA, which include like the University of Guelph, the University of Saskatchewan, farmers, as well as Maple Leaf, Nutrien, the Royal Bank, for example, working through how would you develop the MRVs, the measurement, the reporting, and the verification processes to enable this. GIFS is involved with a project that started with an MOU between Bayer and the government of Saskatchewan, along with the University of Saskatchewan, to look at how would you actually implement that ability to measure and report. And this goes beyond the voluntary. This would be kind of if you're going to be trading carbon, how do you really line it up and lean it in? So those are activities. I don't know how well industry is engaged in this conversation. And again, I think it's an all hands on deck. I think there's vehicles for this. Within Canada, I think we have a unique position with the National Ag and Food Performance Index, which has over 150 members in that coalition from all sectors of agriculture. And again, leaning into that power that we have of the whole value chain, I think would be really important for us to be effective.
Thank you very much. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Perron, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Question for the market gardeners. You talked about financial support and predictability. What's your general view on risk management? Risk management programs are no longer sufficient, especially in the last 3 years. I'll speak about Quebec. We had been hit in 2022 by pests and disease. In 2023, we had torrential rains, 2024 as well, and that's where we're seeing that risk management programs are no longer working at all. So there's no real support. If we are faced with more regulatory requirements, some people will just have to pull out of their operations. In spite of the goodwill that we were hearing about, there doesn't seem to be the same rigor in inspections of food coming in from abroad. Well, many products have to be inspected before they cross into the U.S., like onions and potatoes. So the number of inspections for imported products, the last we heard, it was 1 in 500 loads being inspected. Very tangible example from a few months ago in midwinter. 50 Canadians found themselves in hospital after consuming cantaloupes from Mexico, and some never made it out of the hospital. So that's how well the risk management system worked. All resources invested in controlling risk management when we have field greens in Ontario and Quebec. As far as I know, there's no vegetable, there are no greens being harvested in winter in Canada. So is all that effort put into inspecting the greens coming in, or are they simply cutting the hours and therefore cutting expenses, seizing the opportunity? I won't answer that. I think it's questionable. You and in my question to Ms. Donoghue brought up carrots from China. You've also mentioned Mexico. What's missing? What's missing here? You are experiencing the problems day to day, the problems of having to compete with people who just don't have to apply the same rules of the game that you do. We were talking about crop protection products that are used there and here. Other requirements. What's missing here? What recommendations would you make so that things could improve? Well, carbon standards are different from one country to another, from one province to another. In Quebec, there's Agriclimat researchers who are looking at carbon consumption and what carbon is doing to farming environments in Quebec. And we're seeing that the more the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, the more pesticides you have to use. So is that really a good thing? Do we really need to increase our use of pesticides to reduce GHG? In market gardening, it's by reducing the use of machinery. We have to, if we reduce the use of pesticides, the only way of reducing GHGs is to reduce our use of machinery. If we don't have the same crop protection in place, can we really reduce emissions? I received an email from a farmer a few days ago that antitrust behavior from California, an ultra competitive and very low offers for broccoli directly to consumers. That price wouldn't even allow Quebec to cover its production costs. That producer would have to sell at a loss. I have other examples, 5 or 6. Well, what kind of choices does that leave us? If we do nothing, you'll vanish and people will move on to do other things. If we impose customs tariffs to control the problems will increase costs. So this is not an easy problem to solve. What do you suggest? Well, reciprocity. If a standard is put in place here, there needs to be an equivalent standard on the other side of whatever border we're exporting to or importing from. Quebec standards are always higher than those of other jurisdictions. We're talking about minimum wage, mandatory housing conditions. We have a lot of regulations that farmers have to comply with that simply do not apply to the producers exporting to us. So if the retailer's code of conduct fulfills its promise, what retailers have to pay in increased costs will be passed on to consumers. Thank you. Mr. Canning, 6 minutes.
Well, thanks for everyone being here today. I'm going to start with Mr. Webb. Thank you for your presentation. It was quite illuminating, and I'm just, again, trying to figure out how far are we from, a carbon border adjustment for agriculture in the world. We hear the EU is bringing in CBAM, which is for specific sectors, at least initially, but all the witnesses we've heard from point out how complex calculating the impact of this on agriculture, or how to calculate these adjustments would be for agriculture. I'm just wondering, first of all, have you heard any real talk in your circles that this is on its way? Ms. Murray suggested that it's kind of we're on that path. Is that what you feel we're doing?
I think, thanks for the question. And first, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you exactly when it's going to come. But when we think about opportunities and trends, again, from a Canadian perspective, I think we have a wonderful track record on sustainable production of food. I think we have an opportunity to also look at the potential to reward farmers with new value streams from being able to sequester carbon. Projects that we are directly involved with and other activities that are taking place are all, like I mentioned, CANZA, are all working towards developing protocols that can enable that type of procedure. The issue is Canada is doing this, and I do not know where the rest of the world is. Because again, as Mr. Barlow's question, and I talked too long in the answer, but the point is that getting us to a national international harmonization, I think is absolutely key. And that's one of the things that I think is essential. We need to make investments. Canada is not ready to implement this because we need to make sure that we represent fairly our good story at the farm gate.
Yeah, and this is what it strikes me, is that we have overall, it sounds like, a very good track record from a Canadian perspective in sustainability. But that sustainability, and I think you mentioned some examples yourself, varies from farm to farm, from ranch to ranch. The practices of the farmers, where they are in Canada, where they are in the climate, in the soil system. There's so many variables, and we want to reward those people doing good things and not hinder them. If we came in with just a standard average score for Canada, there wouldn't be any benefit for farmers to exceed that and do better like some are now. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas of how we could put that into a measurement scheme for an initiative like this.
One of the things that I think it's important to comment on is the success that Canadian farmers have today is driven by their entrepreneurial and innovation mindset. the adoption of technologies, they're very, does this make sense from a business perspective? Like the development of no-till was initially around how do I do moisture management and reduce soil erosion, protect my most important investment. And you see the widespread adoption of that technology. At the time it was done, I don't think anybody imagined it was also going to help capture carbon, a big component of capturing carbon. So again, I think the Canadian system hasn't had to have kind of these incentives to be able to get to where we are today. I think we need to have incentives to develop the reporting structure to get into these new markets. And we need to have incentives to move to the next level to make Canada even better. Again, it's not good enough to stay where we are. We have the opportunity to go even further.
You know, it seems that there's so many steps here. We have to figure out the measurement protocols. And then we have to have agreements with the countries that we're exporting, importing with. You know, will this necessitate further side letters or whatever, bilateral agreements or broad agreements with something like the EU on how we do this? Because it seems that it's going to take something like that where we get down really into the nitty-gritty, into the details, as you say. And I'm just, you know, I'm not an expert in this, but how that rolls forward, if you have any thoughts on that.
In about 15 seconds.
Well, I think where they've started with the built industries that have defined work processes, that's a good place to start. We need to embrace the differences of agriculture.
Thank you very much. Maintenant, Monsieur Lehoux, pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Liu, 5 minutes. Ms. Lefebvre, you and your colleague have said that the regulatory agency is very, very slow in approving crop protection products that are used in most other countries. But here it's taking a long time to get them approved. Is that a lack of willingness to move ahead, do you think, or something else? Why does it take so long? You're being asked to produce very high quality products. We'll come back to the border issue in a moment. But when it comes to regulations and approval of products used in other countries, where do you think the problem lies? Well, the administration's very cumbersome. That makes it take a long time. And there's a question of reciprocity of standards. Requirements here are higher than those in U.S. regulations. So when in the spring we were being asked whether environmental options should be added to new forms of certification or new certifications, that is not done in the States. The very cumbersome bureaucracy that is associated with all crop protection products is an issue. As I was saying earlier, the product that was rejected, we asked for certification in 2012. It was rejected in 2025. In fact, you still haven't quite got it, if I understand correctly. That is a huge issue. Talking about reciprocity, but that's an issue. I was surprised to hear you say that because in January things that grow in the summer don't grow. So where do you put those resources? Are they used to check products coming in as stringently as products grown in Canada during the summer would be checked? Well, this is why I think the whole risk management issue has to be explored in greater depth. As we were saying, we've barely touched on risk management protocols. I'd be interested in comparing risk management programs for products in Canada, what risks are being controlled, and compare that to risk management practices in countries where regulations are far less stringent than in Canada. In Canada, we have stringent regulations, so I presume that risk management should be less stringent than it would be for products that come from countries recognized for having far more lax public health and other standards. Coming back to what's happening at the border, the agency, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, seem to want to reassure us, and I'm not too sure whether that reassurance holds, that they do apply satisfactory inspections and requirements at the borders. Do you have anything to show that this is not so? You've mentioned carrots from China, but is there an example of products coming from the U.S. or Mexico? Every year at the holidays, if you remember, a romaine lettuce from California is often has to be recalled because it's contaminated with E. coli, and that is pathogenic in humans. So we have standards for that here. We have water testing to conduct several times a year to check that there are no pathogens. It's very unusual for us to see E. coli or salmonella on products grown in Canada. What would you recommend to the committee? This is really very relevant. What can we do to highlight this in our final report? What can we recommend? That the same number of inspections conducted on our exported products be applied to imported product. Everything we produce has to be inspected by the CFIA. The second thing that we think is crucial is to have the same foundations, the same basis for carbon pricing. So reciprocal standards, even playing field.
I'll go to Mr. McDonald for up to 5 minutes.
Enjoy your testimony. I agree with almost everything that you're actually saying. I certainly believe that we are moving toward cross-border tariffs, and eventually it will likely get to agriculture. There's a lot of bridges to cross prior to that, but I think what you've talked about relative to crop rotation, precision farming, rotational grazing, nutrient management, and other things that our farmers are doing puts us in a very good position. And I think farmers should be rewarded for that. It brings me back to my thoughts about carbon credits and how they are being measured or will be measured for farmers as well, because I think that's an opportunity as well. The opportunity, I think, lies in some of our imports and aligning ourselves with the U.S. And before Congress now, there are 4 bills basically that are skirting the issue of carbon credits. A couple of them are actually measuring inputs, and they're also being applied by the Democrats and the Republicans, which they don't obviously agree much on. So I guess my question back to you, and this may be repetitive, but I think it's worth it, is how do we bring industry and government together to ensure that we're doing everything we can for, if it's not 2025 or 2026, the UK, the EU, and the US now moving in that direction. And we all know if the US starts seeing an advantage to their industries and sectors, and I think Ms. Taylor-Roy talked about 73% of Americans that were surveyed want cross-border tariffs. So it also becomes a geopolitical issue if it gets to that point. So I'm wondering, how do we bring everybody together to ensure that we're doing everything that we can for our farmers?
One of the things that I wonder about, and maybe even the testimony today is an example of it, there doesn't seem to be a clear Canadian strategy on ag. You've got it spread across ECCC, Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, Global Affairs Canada. You have agencies involved. Again, I think the opportunity for Canada, like I said in my comments, is this is a leadership opportunity for Canada. And it contributes a great deal to the gross domestic product. We need to grow our GDP, our real GDP. I think it's an opportunity for us. And I think that's where I think from an outsider's perspective, I think that is kind of what's lacking. It seems to be, if we're getting in trade where we're talking about agriculture, we need a national strategy on ag, and we need to be able to execute against a national strategy on ag. That national strategy needs to be a framework that is regionally specific, because again, what is right in Quebec and Ontario will not be right for Western Canada or British Columbia and vice versa. And it's not bad that there are differences. We need to embrace the differences because we can compete and win.
I guess my thought is a national regional difference, but my thoughts go directly to the U.S., our biggest trading partner, and saying we have to align ourselves with them to ensure that everything we do is going to be measured or adjusted relevant to what they're doing. I guess if you take it one step further, I get it. I come from Prince Edward Island, so we may do things quite different than in Western Canada, although I think things are relatively similar in some regards.
So I think one of the things that I think is really important is that we align ourselves with jurisdictions that embrace science-based, transparent regulatory frameworks. It goes back to Mr. Barlow's question about as long as we have transparency and we know what the rules of the game are, this creates an opportunity for Canada. Where it is not where it's not transparent and not science-based, I think it's a very dangerous situation for us. So again, I think the U.S. has a framework that is more aligned with Canada than the European Union.
Fine, Chair. Thank you. Thank you.
Monsieur Parent, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Mr. Perron, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I come back to what you were discussing with Mr. Liu, you want the same frequency of inspections, the same attention paid to imported products as to yours. So those recommendations will not be difficult to draft. Now, when it comes to certification, accreditation, there was a time when our producers could not get certification for some products that were yet used, that were nonetheless used on carrots in the U.S. that we imported. Is there an issue between agencies? How do you see the problem? And do you think it might be possible to set up a form of international cooperation so that things can be more fluid without reducing quality standards, sharing expertise? I'd like to hear you on that. I'd like to point out that on our labels, and this is something that restricts the number of crop protection products here, labeling. Our labels are so cumbersome that crop protection producers don't want to export their products to Canada, so they produce them for the U.S. and other countries, but they won't produce them for Canada. That's what happened with Betanix for beet. So, international cooperation, yes, that's the dream solution. Now, can it be achieved? I don't think so, because when we think about China and Mexico, the equipment they use to apply crop protection products are very different from ours, so that the labels can't be the same. I was thinking more about cooperation between Canada, the U.S., and Europe. We could share the burden of testing certified products if jurisdictions recognize one another's qualifications. well, if we don't have the same products as Mexico, because Mexico's not in that agreement, we'll yet again have the heaviest burden on our shoulders. That was a good example you gave. We were asking for Hyluron approval, and it was a race against the clock because we needed Canadian authority approval. And the manufacturer said, look, I can sell all my product on the U.S. market. It was really 1 minute to midnight, and we did not see the quantities we would have needed coming here. That is a form of protectionism, really. We've chosen to no longer make such products in Canada. We are becoming extremely dependent on other countries for supply. Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Canning.
Merci. I'm just going to finish off with Mr. Webb, trying to figure out what the role of some of the broader world agencies around this, like the WTO. If we move to a system where we have carbon border adjustments in agriculture, how will that be regulated? Will it be more bilateral trade agreements? Will it be something under the umbrella of the WTO that could set up this? And how does, there's certain sections of the WTO that seem kind of dysfunctional right now because of how the United States is playing into it. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, on sort of the higher level issues.
Well, I think it's evident that the director of the WTO actually embraces the idea of these border carbon adjustments, but it's the membership of the WTO that has to get on board with this. And again, it comes down to how do we get everybody on the same page? So the comment about harmonization and alignment is so critical. I think the WTO is going to have a role, as the last panel, I can't remember the lady's name, talked about the devil in the details and the risk of these border adjustments being seen as a non-tariff trade barrier or as an unfair government subsidy, I think are very real. And again, before implementing a policy, knowing how you're going to adjudicate, I think, is absolutely essential, and it requires those international trade organizations to be on board. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast.
Thank you.
Dr. Webb, just one final question. I think what I'm hearing today is look, the elephant in the room has been around carbon pricing in agriculture, largely non-existent on-farm fuels. C234 is before the House. I chide my Conservative colleagues sometimes about when it might be called. But I think the broader question, whether or not carbon pricing applies or not, there would be some other form of contribution, let's say, from the industry. Like if we believe that there's work to be done, and I take the point that you've made about the fact that farmers have done this by adopting technologies, they've been focused on innovation, but there may come a time that there is a trade-off between the economy and the environmental outcome and how we actually go about finding that balance. If you held the pen, because I take your point about a Canadian ag strategy and regional pieces, that's all fine. But we're talking about Canada's position in the world as how we reconcile both Canada's existing, perhaps, competitive advantage on sustainability, but also the idea that we want to continue working industry-wide, not just agriculture, on reducing emissions, and we don't want to undermine competitiveness in a world where we are trading globally. How would you, if you had the pen, how would you construe it? Would it be, I'm not hearing about CBAM, but maybe is it a club approach that you would align with other countries that are clearly asking their agriculture industry to do something, whether it be on pricing or it be on other types of initiatives such as massive government subsidies to try to help industry that has an impact to the taxpayer's purse? How would you draw, if you had the pen, in about 1 minute?
Thanks for the job, Mr. Chair. I think again, one of the things that I think from a Canadian perspective is we need a unified voice on agriculture. And one of the things, like, we don't have an ambassador for agriculture. We've got lots of people around that talk, but not a unified voice, not a common voice to champion this. I think that is something that we could really use. on the standpoint of how we do the implementation, again, it has to be bang for the buck. And what's the rate of return on the investment? And again, I don't believe we've gotten to where we are in Canada because it didn't make economic sense. It makes economic, environmental, and social sense with everything that the farmers have already done. And we need to be myopically focused on those economic, environmental, and social returns and not see them as a trade-off for one another. And I think that's where the whole mindset shift has to take place. And again, new tools, new innovation is absolutely key. We've heard from the other speakers, witnesses today, about lack of access to tools and technologies. That's a pity. And I know that needs to happen. Canada needs to be at the forefront.
Well, I think we would agree on that. The question is, how do we both reward it and not also have it undermined? So we'll continue this discussion. Thank you to all of our witnesses, I'll say, Madame Lefebvre, Monsieur Bourgoin, and Dr. Webb. Thank you for your testimony on behalf of the members. Thank you, members, for hanging in. I know we had a delayed vote. We will see you bright and early Thursday morning, 8:15. Meeting adjourned.